Hello, everyone, and welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. Today, we're back with Dr. Philip Bunn, political science professor at Covenant College. Wanted to do kind of a quick recap, primer, intro, answer some questions that a lot of people had from last week's podcast about Christian nationalism, where we interviewed the author for the Case of Christian Nationalism, Dr. Stephen Wolfe, and a lot of people just online and in our own personal lives had some more basic questions about Christian nationalism, both from a kind of maybe mainstream misunderstanding, but also some internal divisions within Christian nationalism itself. So, Dr. Bunn, thanks for coming back on pretty shortish notice. So, thank you.
Thanks
No,
for having me. I'm glad to be back.
nice thing about having returning guests, we don't have to do too much of an intro, especially since we recorded that conversation that was released on Friday, now 3 weeks ago. So last week's episode was a little bit wild. Dr. Bunn is now officially moved. He's officially been installed. We're speaking at his new office, which is very, very nice. But Dr. Bunn, why don't you tell us just a little bit more about how you may define Christian nationalism, how it's maybe defined both in and of itself by maybe more not by more scared takes, perhaps more uh, by people who may not know perhaps the intricacies of it. And
Sure. Sorry.
yeah, and we'll do a few follow-ups, of course, but yeah.
Yeah. So I think, as we mentioned in the last episode, the term Christian nationalism in sort of popular discourse, it's existed for a long time, but it really sort of took off in the wake of the events of January 6th, 2021, the protests at the Capitol that becomes a riot at the Capitol, many people carrying various symbols of Christianity there, many of whom, publicly or on Twitter or what have you, saying that this had some relation to their faith and how their faith and politics interacted. And so there were lots of people very interested in sort of how these things happen, how you get from sort of mainstream evangelical Christianity to the Tea Party movement to whatever we saw there. And so there was a sort of flurry of books that came out addressing Christian nationalism. There's been a lot of public commentary on it, both in secular outlets and in Christian outlets, various people offering their takes either from a political perspective or a pastoral perspective. I think one place to go to get a kind of interesting overview, actually, um, of the sort of discourse around it and what most people think it means is just looking at Pew Research Center's writings on this. They have many religion surveys that they do yearly, and they have one particular survey that for multiple years in a row, they've asked questions about things like how much influence the Bible should have in public life, what influence the Bible should have on policy specifically, what influence the Bible should have on policy when the people and the Bible disagree, and they're sort of tracking an increase in certain metrics that they're taking to be constitutive of what I think mainstream people would call Christian nationalism. So compared to the average American, for example, white evangelical is more likely to say the Bible is losing influence in public life. They're more likely to say that the Bible should have more influence in public life. They're more likely to say the Bible should influence policy, even if the will of the people disagrees with the Bible. That, there's something that's true and it should be enacted in policy, even if 50 plus one people disagree with it on a sort of 100% scale. And so that I think is the sort of mainstream view, just that, people who want a stronger influence of religion in public life, people who emphasize the Bible in their political beliefs, those are the people that are sort of getting labeled Christian nationalists by mainstream researchers and writers on these topics. And again, there are some books on this that try to do this in a scholarly way. Dr. Wolf last time mentioned, I'm forgetting the other author, but Samuel Perry's the Flag and the Cross. And so you could look at books like that and see how, for example, I think both of them are sociologists of religion. And so you could look at how academic sociologists are defining the term, what sort of answers on surveys they're looking for to say, yes, this person is a Christian nationalist or not. where the conversation we had with Stephen differs is that now there is a group of people who are sort of owning the label Christian nationalist and saying, yes, I am a Christian nationalist, and here's what it means. And in some cases, they have overlapping agreement with these more public facing definitions. I think some people that you run into on Twitter, for example, who would call themselves Christian nationalists would share these views. Yes, of course, the Bible should have more influence in public life. Yes, a decline in serious belief is bad, etc. But I think they might have more substantive views on top of that. I think they would say, well, this definition is so broad that everyone from some deist founding fathers to Friedrich Douglass to a lot of mainstream evangelicals who are squishy on a lot of things that I'm serious on, all of those would be Christian nationalists, and their views I think would be a bit more narrow and a bit more thick. And so I think that's what you get from the case for Christian nationalism is here's a view that is distinguishable from the mainstream public facing view in the sense that it is far more, I guess, fleshed out and would exclude a lot of people that the more mainstream commentary would include in this banner of Christian nationalist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, and I mentioned last time on the podcast, like I as a Christian would hope that America would be a Christian nation, but kind of having policies downstream from culture. And I do lament the falling away of many people, whether that's cultural Christians or just a lot of Christians becoming nuns, or maybe they didn't really have that strong of faith beforehand. But I do feel like the mainstream press has almost like enlarged the definition of what it means to be a Christian nationalist, because like I admit that I want America to be a Christian nation, but I also want my Muslim citizens or maybe even illegal immigrants to have certain amount of rights in this country, and not all of them to have suddenly second class status or no class status, right? And there's a lot of squishiness there. I'm not a political scientist, so I haven't, nor am I a policy person, haven't thought through even that statement that I just made in example. But yeah, I it's at least nice for someone who has at least studied and articulated their thoughts, like Dr. Wolf. As much as I actually very much strongly disagree, he's staking out a much more concrete example. Although I think the the term Christian nationalist has a lot of weight to it, which is a good segue into our next question. Is Christian nationalism related in any part to fascism, those, or even fascism being a much more right-wing ideology? It's about, say, totalitarianism. That's a little bit that's often coded as left-wing ideology. How do any sort of Christian nationalists, Dr. Wolf, Douglas Wilson, any sort of that movement identify with the fascist movements of the 20s through the 40s, or is that kind of distance? We hear nationalist and we're like, there's a lot of historical baggage there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one thing that's really interesting, I think I may have mentioned this in the last podcast, but the history of nationalism specifically as a concept is a bit strange in how it gets coded or the associations with it. Like you just mentioned, certain political movements that are left coded or right coded. And just to be clear on that, I just mean by that the associations that people have in their minds when they hear these things, right? So sometimes in social science, we talk about literally coding things as in a spreadsheet. Yes or no, does this meet my definition for my purposes of research? I just want to be clear. Just sort of what I mean is right now in our current moment, if you hear populism or you hear nationalism, the flag that's going up in your brain is probably right wing somehow. But for some of history, nationalism was actually a sort of progressive movement, and I mean that literally in the sense that these were people who were fighting for what they saw as a progress in politics, out of sort of colonialism or imperialism. The right of individual people groups within empires or people who had been colonized to have self-determination. And so you see this in nationalist movements in India or in the Middle East or in Europe that are fighting against different empires or colonizers, which are different but too down the rabbit hole right now, that these people are saying, no, we as a people group are different from those people way over there who are trying to rule over us. And because we have our own interests, our own local communities, we ought to have some sort of right of political self-determination. That's where you get things like the United Nations. That's where you get things like the UN Declaration on Human Rights and things like this that do proclaim a right of a certain kind of self-determination of distinct people groups. Those things for a long time were sort of, I would say, more left coded or progressive in the sense that they were throwing off the status quo. But now we've gotten to a point, obviously post World War II, where nationalism and specifically religious nationalism read to us or code to us in our brains as right wing authoritarian, which usually means some kind of fascist. I don't know
Yeah,
that
we
that's
we
fair. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, we even see that kind of on a rise. And speaking of India, in India right now with the current party that didn't do as well as it was hoping to, but there's a lot of anti-Christian, something I want to talk about in later podcasts, but also explicitly anti-Muslim, kind of like if you are Hindi, that means you need to be anti-Muslim, or if you are Hindu,
Mhm.
you need to be anti-Muslim. So we have that kind of like, yes, back in like, if we are national, what does that mean for our religion, right? And there are some that are explicitly tied together. We're not going to go down this rabbit hole, but what does it mean to be a Jew, right? You
Mhm.
cannot be a practicing Jew and still be Jewish. You can be an atheistic Jew and be a citizen of Israel. Does that make you a Zionist? Can you be a Zionist and not be a believer in Yahweh? Like there's this whole sort of spaghettification of that.
Yeah, but to be clear on the question of how related this is to fascism, I would want to distinguish very hard, I think. And the reason for that is fascism, like Christian nationalism, is another very slippery term that ends up being used broadly and being used more as a pejorative against your political opponents than it is sort of a unit of careful analysis. Um, so there's sort of a divide, and I think I mentioned this in the conversation as well in scholars of fascism on how to approach the study of fascism. So one approach says, well, maybe we can find some list of qualifications that would make someone a fascist or not a fascist if they meet this list of definitions or some number of them. Or maybe we can find some sort of bedrock ideology or impulses that would enable us to know fascism when we found it. The other school is a bit more, I would say, I guess, historicist in the sense that they think it would be much more fruitful to just study the people who call themselves fascist, which are quite diverse. And some of them, for example, are very anti-Semitic, and some of them aren't. There are fascist movements in Europe that don't particularly care about the anti-Semitism part. Doesn't mean that they wouldn't ally with anti-Semitic fascists. It just that wasn't a main part of what they cared about. Some of them were nationalist very explicitly. Some of them weren't. There was such a thing as international fascism. Along with international socialism. And so it's a very broad thing that ends up being hard to study as well, partially because for most of us, when we hear fascist, we think Nazi. And as Nazism was developing alongside fascism, the people who called themselves Nazis and the people who called themselves fascists had a lot of internal disagreement. But in our historical consciousness, we tend to conflate the things and take Nazism as like characteristic of all fascism or some sort of definitional fascism. Um, I think that it's very easy to distinguish between modern far right movements and historical fascism. And one really, if people want an introduction to this, I think it's really accessible and really useful. There's this series, the Oxford Very Short Introduction series, which is they're usually quite good. And the Very Short Introduction to Fascism. I'm forgetting the author off the top of my head. It's easily Googleable, but the author has a section on modern far right movements and their relation to fascism. And the author is very careful to sort of say, well, look, a lot of these, far right movements, for example, in France, that give us, Marie Le Pen's father and then her, they have things that people will call fascist. But the author says, well, look, here they're different here, 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 and here from 20th century fascism. They're far right, certainly. They might be authoritarian, certainly, but it was probably wrong to call them fascist. So I want to avoid that as well. But I also want to say that it is undoubtable to me that some of the circles that the online Christian nationalists run in uh, have people in them who are willing to own things that are far more, I would say, fascistic. So it's not hard to find in the comments of Christian nationalist posters on Twitter people who will say things that are openly anti-Semitic or openly in praise of Hitler or openly ethno-nationalist or white nationalist, and they're perfectly willing to own these terms for themselves. And so those people, I would say, I have no problem associating them with these labels. I just wouldn't want to also say, well, you believe X and some other people on Twitter believe X, and but they also believe Y and Z. And so all those people who believe X, Y, and Z are really in your camp too. I want room for the people who only believe X to say, no, no, that doesn't lead to Y and Z. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. That's also a good segue to next question. This kind of seems to be a capital V, capital O, very online movement. Like, how much of this is actually in the real world? Like, January 6th, not a good day in our country's history at all. I'm not going to defend any portion of that. But at the same time, that wasn't that big of a mob, right? It's not like I have seen twice and very much enjoyed the movie that came out in April, Civil War, about what if
Mhm.
America descended into a second American Civil War. We are not seeing New York City having battle tanks of like neo-Confederates and neo-Federalists, right? That did not happen on January 6th. Like, it was not a battle, riot, insurrection, however it's want to be called. So, but how much of this Christian nationalism broadly or as concise as we want to make it is online? Like, this seems to be almost an academic trolley movement that is not too repeatable in the real world. Like, how do you want to break that down?
Yeah, I think it's probably true that a lot of this coalesces online in the sense that some of the things that Christian nationalists want to say often aren't very popular, and it's easier to say them online, especially with sort of anonymous Twitter accounts. The kind of people like Stephen Wolfe who are willing to, especially in the epilogue to his book, kind of come out and say certain controversial cultural things. They're kind of fewer and farther between. Um, but I would say as well that obviously these things have spillover into the real world, and this is honestly something I'm wrestling with still. Is I used to, as a mantra, kind of remind myself. I suppose saying it's a mantra might be controversial. I don't mean to onboard Eastern philosophy here. I just mean it in the colloquial sense. I would have to remind myself that these people that the internet is not real life. And whenever I get really mad about something online, I just say the internet's not real life. I don't know how true that is anymore. I think, especially, for example, those Pew Research surveys I mentioned, what we're seeing is, I think, an influence of these ideas, whether or not people recognize them. The last Pew Research survey that they did, they asked people how aware they were or how much they had read about Christian nationalism. And I'll quote what they say. They say a slim majority of US adults, 54%, say they have heard or read nothing at all about Christian nationalism. But the share of people who are saying things that Pew Research is saying are associated with Christian nationalism is rising dramatically. So it could be that people are getting these sorts of ideas kind of in the cultural water. It's becoming more and more popular to believe these things, whether or not you know anything about this label. And that's what I would think is sort of the influence of the online spilling into the real world. It's not necessarily going to make your grandma start calling herself a Christian nationalist, but she might start saying some of the same stuff that you first heard your Christian nationalist friend saying on Twitter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it does. I continue to think about an Andrew Sullivan article, essay called "We All Live on Campus Now" from 2018, and that is, if this past spring was any indication, that article has proved more and more prophetic over time,
Mm-hmm.
which is unfortunate. But yes, I also like to try to remind myself that Twitter is not real life, but at the same time, I'm kind of like, but is it? Which is
It's
unfortunate.
it's getting more influential, I think. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, then speaking, that's another great segue. Speaking of its influence, hard to not see that this is at least somewhat influential on the Christian conservative traditional, right? I like to call myself a traditional Christian. I do not want gay marriage in my church. I do not want a woman being ordained at all, let alone preaching. A few other, few other checklists I could say for traditional Christian. Um, but this seems to also be coded more on a non-mainstream, and probably not even Catholic or certainly Orthodox, at least in the States, side of the Christian aisle. So why does this attract Presbyterians, Baptists? That actually seems to be the circles I'm most familiar with. Non-denominational, which to me means you're just not associated with the Southern Baptist Convention. That's just me. But yeah, give me any hypothesis of why conservative Christians might be attracted to any sort of even a few checks on the Christian nationalism checklist.
Yeah, I think that actually the negative might be easier to start with in the sense that, why might this not be particularly appealing to Catholics? Why is this not a primarily Catholic movement? I think it could be because um, Catholicism has had within itself, I think, a much more robust conversation about the relationship between their theology and their politics. And I mean that specifically, not just their faith in their politics, but their theology and their politics. We see in the 20th century in America very strong overlap between faith and politics. You get the moral majority, and you get even earlier, you get within Christianity social movements towards things like temperance and what have you, William Jennings Bryan and people like this. And so I think Protestants tend to feel a very robust connection between their faith and their politics, or they certainly can. But the actual sort of rigorous intellectual working through of like, here's we might call it political theology, to use a term. I think the Catholics have been a bit better at doing that in some ways than Protestants have. Now, within Protestantism, there are particular strands of that are more robust than others, I think. So, for example, we had in Reformed Presbyterianism specifically, or Reformed thought generally, a strand of people called Reconstructionists or Theonomists who wrote that thousands and thousands of pages of stuff defending their particular theology of politics and how their theology applied to politics. They were never a huge or a majority movement, but they did sort of rigorous work trying to defend this idea. In the Baptist tradition as well, you see a lot of rigorous defense of things like political toleration, and coming out of people like Roger Williams very early on, but also still over in England, you get the sort of dissident wings of the church that become the more radical Anabaptists and things like this. I think the Christian nationalists, and especially the ones who are actually writing books and serious articles, are filling kind of an intellectual gap where what Stephen Wolfe is saying is there's a whole tradition of Reformed people thinking about politics from the Reformation on, and they themselves are pulling from older Christians who thought seriously about politics, like Augustine, who he references quite a lot. And we've sort of lost that. We don't do that sort of hard work anymore to do political philosophy as Reformed Christians. So I think that's maybe why it has some appeal. Other people have sort of found landing points. Well, I think there's this mass of people who are um, sort of homeless in their political theology and are looking for something to kind of latch onto. But that isn't to say that there isn't appeal outside of just like Presbyterians, for example. I know plenty of online Lutherans who I think would call themselves a Christian nationalists. I know that I think there's some overlap actually with some online Eastern Orthodoxy. And certainly even some Catholics, although I think they prefer some other terms. They tend to lump themselves into groups like the integralists or, post-liberals broadly, and they don't necessarily latch on to our terms. But I think there is movement appeal outside of Presbyterianism or the Reformed tradition generally, but it does seem to be concentrated there. I think I'd agree. Yeah.
You've also in that mentioned that some people were just latching on. Does that mean it's because they're political homeless? I feel politically homeless. I live in a very blue city and in a blue county. So whenever I try to vote, it's normally I try to pick the most moderate of a Democrat. But I for a very long time voted Republican all the way House, state, my state legislature, stuff like that. But ever since 2016, I've had to be very, very informed on whoever I'm voting for because I just don't feel very politically at home anywhere. Does that mean people who are subscribing to Christian nationalism are more seeking a home and they found people that'll give them a hug and it's kind of more vibes than anything like, oh, these guys were also homeless. They found something. I want to find something, at least on the periphery, someone like maybe my grandma does start talking about talking points that she heard on Christian talk radio. And she's like, this is making some sense. Is it really just nostalgic vibes for a past that wasn't actually there?
Mm. It's an interesting question, and it's tough to answer because it's one of those things where you risk, I guess, being uncharitable because it might come across like you're saying, yes, those people over there are sort of operating on vibes and feelings, and it was just nice to find people who said some things that sounded good, while me over here in my ivory tower, I understand better, so I want to be careful when I talk about these things because I don't want to come across that way. I want to say, I think I, just like anybody else, my beliefs sort of, especially my political applied beliefs, might develop in sort of communal contexts where it's not, I didn't just sit in my bathtub and reason myself to some sort of transcendent political principles. I'm informed by the people I'm in community with, the people I have lunch with, the people I go to church with. All of these things have influence. I think it's just true, whether we like it or not, that the sorts of people I associate with most, let's say in church and family and social life, will have an influence on the kinds of things that I believe. And so if I do start hanging out with people who are more like online Christian nationalists, I might find some of their things very, very appealing. I might start noticing more, things like immigrants in places I hadn't seen them before, or someone owning a store that I used to go to who's ethnic now and has changed the fabric of the store. Things that people who are these online Christian nationalists start complaining about. That sort of raise your awareness of these things. I think it's a form of a sort of intellectual error that human beings fall into of kind of recency bias. We always talk about this when there's an actual name for this phenomenon, and I'm forgetting it off the top of my head. Is it Bader-Meinhof phenomena? I think it might be, where when you like buy a type of car, you start seeing it everywhere. All of a sudden, it's not like everybody else bought the car after you did. It's just you've now been primed to notice it in a way that you hadn't before. I think what these communities do is sometimes they do provide a nice religious or social home for people. They start bringing up political issues that you maybe hadn't thought about before. And now that they've been, in the political sciencey jargon, made salient, now they're at the top of my head and I start noticing them everywhere. I start seeing the headlines about immigrant violence more. I start seeing immigrants more when I pass them on the street. All of these things sort of get flagged for me in ways that they didn't before. And so I yeah, I don't want to say it is just vibes, and I don't want to say that their criticisms or their complaints are baseless. I want to say that I suppose I can understand how people come to start believing these things and find confirmation for the beliefs as they're forming them, without necessarily agreeing that they're always correct. If that makes sense, I might have sort of been a bit circuitous there, but hopefully that partially answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, it does. Um, well, just two more questions, Dr. Bunn. Thank you so much for your time. How biblical? I know this is a more theological question, but how biblically based is this? Especially listening to Dr. Wolf and reading several articles, prepping for our discussion. He seemed, and a lot of the movement seems to just kind of think of Christian nationalism as nationalism with a Christian afterthought. Like this is our moral history. This is history of the West for the last 2,000 years. There's actually been some really good books about Christian positive influence from secular academics. I will, of course, jump to Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man, but the Oxford professor, and a few others. Bart Ehrman, surprisingly, has written his last two books were about the triumph. One was literally called The Triumph of Christianity, like something I never thought would come out of his mouth. But yeah, how much of this is a sort of like, I got this from my theology, and therefore America should be ruled by Christians, roughly,
Mhm.
if that's what we're basing our definition on, and how much of it is I read a lot of political philosophy, and this kind of fits into my current Rubik's Cube.
Yeah. It's a good question. I think if you were trying to do just a strictly biblical theology of politics, you would probably come away with something different than what Stephen Wolfe and others offer. And I think he is sort of open about this in the sense that he opens the book by saying, "I'm not a theologian. I'm not going to do exegesis. I'm going to be relying on thinkers within a tradition that has developed over time, people who are very smart, who had to deal with things that I didn't have to. They lived through a Reformation and religious persecution. They wrote a lot about how their theology applied to these situations." And he's like, I'm taking this tradition as my tradition. And if you don't agree with the Reformed tradition, well, that's a different conversation, but this is the one I want to have. I'm not going to sort of do the groundwork exegesis myself. So I think if such a thing were possible, if you just sat down with your Bible and tried to develop theology of politics, you would probably, I think, come away, especially by the time you get to the New Testament, with a sort of like hands-off, almost like pacifistic approach, right? Where Jesus says, "Well, render unto Caesar." The apostles, yes, they say we must obey God rather than men, but they don't seem to care about inspiring any political uprising or revolt. Perfectly willing to submit to punishment when they do break unjust laws, though they're willing to break them. These sorts of things. There doesn't seem to be, again, like a clean model there for, well, this is what a Christian nation would look like, because there doesn't seem to be any biblical era optimism that you're going to have a Christian nation. These are, as our guest last time, Jerry said, there's a well developed in the tradition theology of exile, that we're living as residents of an eternal kingdom, but temporarily here in an earthly kingdom that does not always reflect those values, and we have to recognize that.
Yeah, I mean, unlike the Old Testament where they're clearly building a nation and a state, and they go through judges and kings and all that. Like, I mean, there's barely a systematic theology of church hierarchy in the New Testament. I mean, that's why we've seen I mean, I'm Reformed, you're Reformed. I will begrudgingly admit there's some points the Catholics and Eastern Orthodox makes. I will begrudgingly admit there's some stuff the points my Baptist brothers and non-denominational brothers make, but that does I do that because there is so minimal, even at the church level, let alone the state level. I just want to emphasize that I obviously am Reformed, and I think Presbyterianism fits the model of the apostolic and new church age much better than Catholic, mixing two words, excuse me, than Catholicism, or certainly non-denominational, but Baptist as well.
Yeah. So I think to an extent, though, I would also want to, for fairness sake, say, I do think there are principles that are worth drawing out, that Wolf and others do draw out, that we really should be willing to affirm strongly that we do have certain duties to those closest to us that we don't necessarily have in this sort of universal sense. So we have to always, I think, be in tension in Christianity between its universalizing tendencies, which are, yeah, all men are made in the image of God. God desires all people to be saved. I have some sort of spiritual communion with people quite different from me just by virtue of sharing a kind of Nicene Christianity, with the acknowledgement that, like Paul says, for example, that if you don't provide for the members of your own household, you're worse than an unbeliever, right? There seems to be something about these people closest to me that I have duties towards that I really do need to fulfill. What it actually looks like to fulfill those duties in politics becomes a lot more controversial. So for some people, it's perfectly intuitive that duty means, well, I obviously need to privilege the people right here closest to me over and above anyone who might want to move to my country and the benefits they could get from that. So we have very exclusionary immigration policies. I can see the argument they're making. I just wouldn't. I just become uncomfortable when people want to say that is sort of the biblical stance on politics, right? I think it's a bit more nuanced than that, a bit more pragmatic or practical or applied than that, I suppose.
Final question. Gotta ask it. We've mentioned January 6th. We've mentioned politics. Do you think Donald Trump is a Christian nationalist? I will first answer this question, and I think no, because I have huge residency about him even being a Christian. I cannot judge him. I just don't see a lot of evidence of him being a Christian. I think there's actually probably stronger evidence of President Biden being a Christian than Donald Trump. Not that I agree with either one of those men very often. But as the host on this podcast, I wanted to first say I don't think he's a Christian nationalist. If anything, I think Trump is he's at least a decent businessman and sees an opportunity where an opportunity is. And if he is dog whistling for that, whether he knows it or not, it's probably because he's just trying to win an election. But that's
Yeah.
my take. Do you, Dr. Bunn, think that Donald Trump is a Christian nationalist in the vein of Doug Wilson or Stephen Wolfe?
Yeah, I think no is the obvious answer, and I think you're right to say like, well, the first question is is he a Christian or not? And as you said, neither of us can really know that for certain. Neither of us are appointed judges of anybody else's salvation, but I think it's probably an incontrovertible fact that many American presidents have sort of been play acting their faith, that they might not have been the most sincere people ever, but they did attend church and reference scripture, and I think like there's probably truth to that. I'm not going to say that's the majority. I'm just going to say probably at least mid 20th century presidents weren't
Well,
terribly
I mean,
sincere.
we have a long history in this country about that because when Jefferson was running for president, the main attack was that he was an atheist.
Yes, well, and probably the closest to home it may have ever been in those attacks. But my point being that Trump is doing a poor job even of attempting to show that he is a Christian. He doesn't, as he said, we have presidents like Biden or even Obama who regularly attended church, seemed to have far more, I would say, like literacy with the scriptures and things like this. That to me is like I would think would be the bare minimum if you wanted to get elected in this country to sort of at least attempt to demonstrate. Trump doesn't, the very famous moment where he's asked what his favorite Bible verse is, and he says all of them. Just all these things that uh,
Or
yeah.
or he
So
says or he says 2 Corinthians when he's at
yeah,
Liberty University.
yeah. But putting aside the sincerity of his faith, he says he's a man of faith. So if I took that just at face value, I don't think his politics reflect the kind of things that the Christian nationalists want, except insofar as they might be pragmatic. So the greatest example of this, I think, are the changes to the Republican platform going into the convention this year on abortion and marriage. I say we. I've never been a registered Republican, but I'm generically on the political right, so I sometimes say we. They excised references to marriage as one man and one woman from the platform. Now they just talk about the sanctity of marriage without defining it. And they excised the stronger language against abortion from the platform and trimmed it down quite dramatically. From what I recall of politics growing up, that would have been labeled as sort of a compromise of a sort. But the political pragmatists I run into on the internet say, well, no, these are important concessions to obtain political power so that we can then achieve these sort of loftier ends. So maybe Trump is playing 45D chess and doing this sort of long game of political pragmatism that will achieve the ends of the Christian nationalists. I'm not buying it. I think he is a self-motivated seeker after influence and fame and power, and will do what he needs, what he thinks he needs to do to get it. So, yeah.
That's that's about what I think, which is unfortunate. At some point, I even had halfway convinced myself that the Republican Party would probably become more libertarian and that, probably do away with the gay marriage stance, maybe the abortion stance, but stick out a really solid claim on like, we have to do something about our debt, we have to do something about our deficit, we have to make sure that the books are balanced. And Trump being a businessman kind of made me somewhat lie to myself that might have been possible, but his budget and deficits definitely showed something complete opposite of that, something that the Obama and maybe even the Clinton administration would have just slathered over his budgets and deficits. So,
Yep.
Dr. Bunn, thank you for a quick little podcast, just a refresher, a rejoiner, a redux on Christian nationalism, and look forward to possibly having you back, maybe on first week of November. We can do a deep dive on what may or may not has happened, or maybe January 22nd, 2025, see what might happen there. But either way, thank you so much for your time, and thank you all. Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.